The lights dim, and somewhere in that quiet, a voice begins to rise, warm, soulful, and hauntingly familiar. It's the voice of Clydie King, the woman whose sound carried the soul of an era. You might not see her name on the marquee, but you've heard her in the songs that shaped American music. From the small churches of Dallas to the bright studios of Los Angeles, her voice became the hidden heartbeat behind legends Ray Charles, B.B. King, the Rolling Stones, and Bob Dylan. She was the spirit behind the sound, the strength behind the spotlight. What happens when the voice that made others immortal is left in the shadows? Do you remember her voice, even if you never knew her name? Let's get into her story right now. Let me know where you're watching this from in the comments. Grab yourself a warm drink, sit back, and let's start this journey together. Clydie King was born on the 21st of August 1943 in Dallas, Texas, a place where church bells and radio blues blended into one restless sound. Her story began in loss. When she was just 2, her mother passed away, and her older sister became her protector. They didn't have much, but they had faith, and for Clydie, that faith took the shape of a song. The church was her first stage: wooden pews, stained glass, and the hum of voices that believed singing could heal. She wasn't just another child in the choir. Even then, her voice carried weight, a kind of ache that made grown people turn their heads. Every Sunday, she sang like she was offering something back to the world that had already taken too much from her. Gospel didn't just teach her to sing, it taught her to feel. At 8, she got her first glimpse of the wider world. A national television show hosted by Art Linkletter invited her to perform. The bright lights, the cameras, the hush before she began, none of it scared her. She sang with the same truth she had learned in church, and for the first time, applause filled her world. That moment didn't make her a star, but it lit a spark that would guide her for decades. The move to Los Angeles came quietly, like most turning points do. Her family left Dallas in search of a better life, and in the city's sprawl, Clydie found both challenge and opportunity. She graduated from Fairmont High School in 1961, shy but purposeful. While her classmates dreamed of acting or modeling, Clydie was already learning studio discipline, timing, phrasing, listening. She didn't chase fame, she chased improvement. At 13, she caught the attention of songwriter Richard Berry, known for his sharp ear and patient mentorship. He heard in her voice something rare: control, soul, and sincerity. Under his wing, she joined a young group called Little Clydie and the Teens in 1956. The name was playful, but she took the work seriously. Long rehearsals, cheap microphones, take after take. It was there she learned the rhythm of a professional's life. She wasn't looking for stardom, she was learning how to last. Recording for small labels like Specialty, Philips, Minute, and Imperial, Clydie began shaping a sound that was hers alone, rooted in gospel, smoothed by rhythm and blues. Her tone carried warmth and precision, her timing instinctive. In the studio, she was known for getting it right the first time. She didn't need attention to validate her, she needed the music to feel honest. Los Angeles could be cruel to quiet talent. Doors opened slowly, and credits rarely told the full story. But Clydie built her reputation through consistency. She showed up early, stayed late, and treated every song like a promise. Musicians trusted her, producers relied on her. She was the kind of voice you called when you wanted a song to shine but didn't want the singer to outshine the star. Even then, she understood her role to be the foundation others could stand on. It was a lesson that came naturally to a woman raised on harmony, not spotlight. She blended into the background with grace, not resentment. That humility became her strength. In rooms full of ego, she stayed quiet, letting the music speak. By the late 1950s, whispers of her name began to travel through studios. She could find harmonies others missed, and her tone carried emotion that couldn't be taught. She was young, but her voice sounded lived in, touched by both struggle and faith. Every note she sang came from somewhere real. Imagine her at 16 standing before a microphone in a small Los Angeles studio, headphones too large, a single lamp glowing above her. Outside the booth, men adjust dials and smoke cigarettes. But inside, she's still that girl from Dallas, singing to the heavens. There's no fame yet, no contracts, no promise of anything beyond the next take. But in her face there's focus, in her heart, certainty. She knows that if she keeps singing, something will come. Before the legendary names, before the tours and the whispers of fame, there was only a girl who sang because silence hurt too much. Her beginnings were not glamorous, but they were sacred, born of faith, loss, and the simple belief that music could outlast pain. Clydie King didn't set out to be famous. She set out to be true. And long before the world ever learned her name, she had already become exactly what every great artist hopes to be: undeniable. By the time Clydie King finished high school, Los Angeles had already begun to hum with her name, not in headlines, but in studio hallways where the real work of music was done. She wasn't the kind of singer who chased attention. She was the one producers called when they needed a voice that could hold a song together. Her path into the industry didn't start with fame, it started with trust. Her first years as a recording artist were a study in quiet persistence. She worked with labels like Specialty, Phillips, Minute, and Imperial, moving between gospel, soul, and rhythm and blues with the same ease she once moved between church hymns and pop radio. There was something in her tone that made people listen, twice a warmth that could soften brass, and a precision that could steady an entire track. In the mid-1950, Clydie's early group, Little Clydie and the Teens, recorded a handful of singles that never broke through commercially, but caught the ear of people who mattered. Those studio sessions were her real education. She learned to breathe with the beat, to find harmony where others heard only noise, and to adapt to every genre that crossed her path. While others dreamed of the spotlight, she learned how to build the sound behind it. That discipline led her to work with some of Los Angeles's most demanding producers. Phil Spector was one of them, a perfectionist known for his wall of sound. Few singers could handle his endless takes, but Clydie could. Her patience and tone made her invaluable. To the outside world, these credits went unnoticed. To those inside the business, she was quickly becoming a secret weapon. Her reputation reached Ray Charles, the architect of soul. When he invited her to join his backing group, the Raylettes, it was both an honor and a test. Touring with Ray Charles in the late 1950s meant long nights, tight harmonies, and a crash course in professionalism. On stage, the Raylettes were the heartbeat of his band, a blend of gospel intensity and nightclub polish. Clydie stood alongside singers like Mary Clayton, whose friendship would last for decades. Together, they built a sound that could make audiences weep one minute and dance the next. Being a Rayolette also meant living in two worlds, the glory of standing behind a genius and the humility of never being the headline. But Clydie never complained. She understood that real artistry didn't depend on being seen. It depended on being felt. In smoky clubs and crowded theaters, her harmonies wrapped around Charles's voice like velvet, adding the fullness that turned songs into sermons. Those years taught her more than any contract could. She learned how to survive the road, how to protect her voice, how to stay calm when everything around her was chaos. Most of all, she learned that music, real music, was a collective act. It wasn't about who stood in front or behind. It was about making something worth remembering. By the time the 1960 began, Clydie King was no longer a promising newcomer. She was a professional, respected, steady, and trusted by legends. The world hadn't learned her name yet, but inside the studios of Los Angeles, it was spoken with quiet admiration. She had become what every young singer dreams of being, the kind of artist whose work speaks long after the song ends. Clydie King's rise didn't come through publicity or luck. It came through the slow, steady rhythm of work, studio by studio, song by song, until her voice became the sound producers reached for when they wanted truth inside the mix. By the late 1960s, her phone never stopped ringing. Every call led to another chance to shape the soundtrack of her time. Rock and roll was changing. The polished sound of pop was giving way to something more human, rough edges, gospel fire, the ache of real life. That was where Clydie belonged. Her church-born phrasing and her sense of restraint made her a secret ingredient in sessions for some of the biggest names in the world. With Humble Pie, she added the heat that turned their blues into fire. With B.B. King, her voice softened the pain into prayer. With the Rolling Stones, she gave chaos a kind of grace. Then came Joe Cocker's Mad Dogs and Englishmen tour in 1970, part circus, part spiritual revival. On stage, the band looked like a storm of sound, yet Clydie's voice always found its place in the middle, rising steady through the noise. She didn't fight to be heard. She trusted that the right sound would find her. Night after night, she proved that control could be as powerful as volume. Her connection with Cocker's friend Leon Russell opened a new chapter. Russell recognized what others had missed. Clydie wasn't just a harmony singer, she was a storyteller. When producer Gabriel Meckler formed Lizard Records, she was one of the first artists invited to record. Surrounded by world-class musicians, including Billy Preston on keys, she finally stood at the microphone, not as support, but as center. The 1971 album Direct Me was a quiet triumph. It didn't explode on the charts, but it revealed everything she had learned: phrasing that cut straight to emotion, rhythm that carried the weight of gospel, and lyrics sung like confessions. Her single, About Love, reached number 45 on the R&B charts, a modest success to the public, but a victory to the woman who had spent her life behind other people's names. In the studio world, musicians talk less about fame and more about feel. After Direct Me, the way people talked about Clydie changed. She wasn't just a reliable session voice anymore, she was a sound of her own. Her name began to appear quietly in liner notes that would one day become history. Exile on Main Street with the Rolling Stones in 1972, Walking by the River with Ray Brown, and countless others. She didn't chase the spotlight that finally flickered her way, she kept working. In 1973, she and her longtime friend Mary Clayton added backing vocals to Sweet Home Alabama. The song stirred controversy for its message, but Clydie treated the session as she always had, with professionalism, empathy, and focus. Her part wasn't about politics, it was about harmony, and she delivered it perfectly. By now, her voice had touched every corner of American music: rock, soul, blues, gospel, but few outside the business knew her face. The industry had a word for singers like her: indispensable. She didn't need fame to prove her worth. The records already did that. Clydie King had crossed from hopeful to legendary without ever demanding the title. She was the steady pulse behind an era, the voice you felt even when you didn't know her name. The lights were brighter now, not the kind that blinded, but the kind that made everything feel inevitable. A console lit with meters in the green, a talkback mic clicking on, a producer's hand rising and then falling to say, roll. In that glow, Clydie King stood where she had always belonged, inches from the microphone, headphones cupped, ready to lift a song higher than it knew it could go. The work that brought her here had been quiet, but the results were not. Sessions with Leon Russell gave her room to move the kind of arrangements that asked for soul without shouting. Beside players who could turn a groove into a gospel, Clydie brought the center. Billy Preston sat at the keys like a sermon with a backbeat, and she threaded her tone through the chords until the track breathed. Nothing about it felt accidental. It felt earned. In 1971, she stepped to the front. Lizard Records put her name on the sleeve Direct Me, and for once, the voice behind the legends became the headline on wax. The room held its breath for a different reason now. There was no star to support, no chorus to vanish into. It was Clydie King, unadorned. About Love climbed to number 45 on the R&B chart, a number to some, a milestone to her. It proved what musicians already knew. The same presence that made other artists sound complete could carry an entire record on its own. Success did not pull her away from the community that had shaped her. She kept answering the calls that defined the era. When the Rolling Stones built Exile on Main Street in 1972, a record that sounded like midnight and victory at once, Clydie's harmonies gave the grit, a human center. She wasn't there to sweeten edges. She was there to reveal the song inside the swagger. On Tumbling Dice and beyond, her blend turned noise into heat, groove into testimony. There were moments when the spotlight touched her more directly. On Walking by the River, she stepped forward and the band stepped back, the way a congregation falls quiet when the soloist rises. The timbre in her voice carried distance and returned Dallas to Los Angeles, church to studio, and the melody floated like a hymn that remembered every street it had traveled. You could hear a lifetime in the way she leaned on a vowel, the way she let a note fall and settle where only truth can land. The peak wasn't just what she recorded, it was what she had become. By now, band leaders asked for her by name. Engineers knew how her voice sat in a mix before she even sang. Young singers watched from the couch in the live room, memorizing the way she marked a chart, the way she saved her voice until the red light came on, the way she hit a harmony the first time and never missed it again. In a business that often confused noise for power, Clydie King practiced a subtler authority: control, intention, care. She felt the applause not the kind that follows fame, but the kind musicians keep for their own: a nod from the drummer, a smile from the bass player, a producer's quiet, "That's it." This was the currency of her peak, and she spent it wisely. She moved through studios like a steady flame, giving heat without burning out, giving light without demanding to be seen. And yet, even at the summit, she carried a softness that refused to turn triumph into arrogance. Clydie didn't arrive as a comet. She arrived as a sunrise, sure, steady, and exactly on time. The era needed her sound, and she gave it freely. For once, the world felt aligned with the life she had built note by note. The songs were bigger, the rooms were louder, the names were legendary, and Clydie King stood at the center of it all, making the extraordinary feel simple and the simple feel holy. At her peak, Clydie King was surrounded by music that never stopped. One week it was the Rolling Stones. The next, it was Joe Cocker, Leon Russell, or B.B. King. Every studio seemed to have her voice tucked somewhere in the background, the quiet thread that kept everything from falling apart. But behind the rhythm and applause, a silence began to form, the kind only an artist can hear. Fame, in those years, was a fickle light. It shone brightest on those who demanded it, and passed quickly over those who didn't. Clydie never demanded anything. She was grateful, careful, always professional. But Hollywood rarely rewards grace. As records climbed the charts, her name was buried in the credits, sometimes misspelled, sometimes missing altogether. She wasn't bitter, not yet. She just kept working, trusting that the work itself would speak louder than absence. Still, the imbalance grew harder to ignore. The men she sang beside became icons. The women behind them became memories. The industry called it business. She called it life. Every time she heard her voice on the radio, she felt a strange mix of pride and distant joy for the music, ache for the anonymity. She knew she was part of something eternal, but eternity doesn't pay the rent. There was also the toll of constant motion. Studio sessions bled into tours, and tours bled into sleepless nights. In hotel rooms where laughter faded fast, she wrote small notes to herself on scrap paper, reminders to drink water, to pray, to rest. Some nights, she called home just to hear a familiar voice. Other nights, she stayed quiet, letting exhaustion hum through her body like a second melody. The early 1970 were kind and cruel in equal measure. She stood shoulder to shoulder with legends, but in photographs, she was often cropped out, a face in the blur, a voice in the mix. It wasn't malice, just the way things were. The industry thrived on invisibility. Someone had to hold up the stage so others could stand tall. Clydie understood that better than anyone, and yet, something shifted. The joy that once filled her singing began to feel heavier, more fragile. She spoke less between takes, laughed less at rehearsals. Her friends noticed. They said the long hours and quiet credit had started to wear on her spirit. Even success can be lonely when no one says your name out loud. Then came the project that would haunt her sweet home Alabama in 1973. Clydie and her friend Mary Clayton lent their harmonies to a song that stirred deep controversy. Its message didn't sit right with them, two black women raised on gospel and struggle. But work was work, and professionalism meant finishing what you started. When the record became a hit, the applause was loud. But for Clydie, it rang hollow. By then, the seeds of tragedy had been planted not in scandal or collapse, but in silence. The kind of silence that grows when the world keeps taking and never gives back. She was still singing, still strong, still beloved by the musicians who knew her worth. But beneath that strength was fatigue. And beneath the fatigue, a quiet question: how long can someone lift others before they fall from sight completely? The lights hadn't gone out yet, but the shadows had begun to move closer. The applause had faded long before Clydie King ever stopped singing. By the late 1970s, the world of music was changing fast, loud, and restless. The stages were bigger, but the spirit that had once filled them felt smaller. Disco ruled the airwaves, rock was reinventing itself, and soul was slipping quietly into nostalgia. For a singer like Clydie, whose gift had always been honesty, there was less and less space to be heard. The work slowed, but she didn't. She kept showing up to sessions, her voice steady even when the paychecks weren't. The phone rang less, the rooms got quieter, and the names on the studio doors grew unfamiliar. Some nights she'd drive home through Los Angeles traffic with the radio on, hearing the next generation of singers, young, polished, hungry, and wonder if they knew the shoulders they were standing on. Most didn't. Her friends said she carried herself with the same calm she always had, but there was a tiredness in her eyes now. The endless travel, the long nights, the years of being heard but unseen, it had a weight no one could measure. When the spotlight never belonged to you, the silence afterward can feel endless. She still sang in churches sometimes, the way she had as a child, the same pews, the same hymns, but a different kind of prayer. Her voice was deeper now, richer, marked by the years. The congregation didn't see a forgotten star. They saw a woman who had given her life to music and asked for nothing in return. In those moments, she was home again, just Clydie. No credits, no applause, only song. Then came Bob Dylan. Their paths crossed around 1980 during his born-again period, when he was searching for something beyond fame and found comfort in gospel. Clydie joined his circle of singers, and together they built harmonies that felt more like devotion than performance. She understood his faith because it mirrored her own, fragile but sincere. What began as music slowly turned into companionship, and soon, whispers began to follow them. Some said they were secretly married, that they shared not only a home but children, too. Dylan never confirmed it, and neither did she. For Clydie, love was private, sacred, not a headline. But even love can't undo exhaustion. The years on the road, the constant giving, the invisibility they had taken their toll. Opportunities thinned. Her body started to ache in ways she couldn't ignore. There were hospital visits, blood tests, doctors who spoke softly. Friends called to check in, but she often didn't answer. It wasn't pride, it was fatigue. Sometimes it's easier to rest in silence than to explain how the dream turned heavy. By the time the 1980 faded into the 1990, Clydie King was living quietly, away from the cameras and chaos she'd once steadied. To the public, she had vanished. To the people who had shared stages with her, she remained unforgettable. They spoke her name with respect, the kind that doesn't need to trend to matter. There was no scandal, no dramatic fall, only time, gravity, and the quiet truth that even the strongest voices eventually need to rest. The world had moved on, but for those who remembered, her songs were still there, echoing softly through the years. And though the lights had dimmed, Clydie King's voice had not gone out. It had simply gone home. By the time the spotlight turned elsewhere, Clydie King had already made peace with being unseen. She had lived long enough to understand that recognition doesn't always follow contribution. Hollywood moved on, as it always does, and her name faded from liner notes and contracts. But those who worked beside her never forgot. They said you could still hear her tone in the echoes of songs that defined entire decades. In the years after her work with Bob Dylan, she lived quietly, almost invisibly. Fame had passed her by, but dignity never did. She stayed in Los Angeles, close to the neighborhoods where she'd first learned to sing, surrounded by people who knew her not as a legend, but as Clydie kind, reserved, and always listening. The woman who had once carried choirs of sound now carried silence, and somehow that suited her. Money was never her motive, but it became her worry. The royalties were thin, the checks irregular. She'd given her voice to dozens of hit records, but contracts back then were rarely kind to background singers. Each year, the calls for work grew fewer, until the sessions stopped altogether. There were no farewell tours, no documentaries, no awards. The world simply looked away, distracted by newer names, louder trends. And yet, she didn't disappear out of bitterness. She withdrew out of choice. She spent more time at home, sometimes joining small church groups, sometimes just sitting by a window with the radio on, smiling when an old song came through the static. The people in those recordings, Ray Charles, B.B. King, Joe Cocker, were gone or going too. She was part of a generation whose music had outlived its makers. There were moments of quiet recognition. A critic might mention her name in a footnote. A fellow artist might tell a story on stage about this incredible woman named Clydie King. Each mention was a flicker, a reminder that her contribution had never vanished, only drifted out of view. In 2019, the news came softly, almost like her singing, Clydie King had passed away on January 7, at the age of 75, from complications related to a blood infection. There were no headlines, no special tributes on late-night TV. But the people who knew the ones who had heard her voice wrap around theirs in harmony felt the loss like a missing note. Bob Dylan himself would later speak of her with reverence, calling her, "my ultimate singing partner." It was a quiet ending, but a noble one. No scandals, no self-destruction, just a woman who had given all she had to the art she loved. The tragedy wasn't in how she lived, it was in how easily the world forgot. In some ways, her life mirrored her music, steady, beautiful, never demanding attention. And just like her harmonies, her story slipped into the background of history, waiting for someone to listen closely enough to realize she was there all along. When the final note faded, the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of memory, of gratitude, of everything she had poured into a world too hurried to thank her. Time has a way of revealing what applause once hid. Long after the crowds have gone home, the songs remain, and within them, the voices that gave those songs life. Clydie King's voice is still there, woven through the history of American music like a quiet thread of truth. You can hear her in the echo of Ray Charles's gospel, in the edge of the Rolling Stones' swagger, in the tenderness of Bob Dylan's late records. She didn't just sing behind legends, she shaped how those legends were heard. To understand her legacy, you have to listen closely. Clydie wasn't famous for invention or rebellion. Her gift was elevation. She could take someone else's melody and make it sound inevitable. Her harmonies gave structure to chaos, grounding emotion with grace. In an industry obsessed with spotlight and image, she represented something far rarer: devotion to the craft itself. That devotion, that refusal to compromise the music for the market, became her quiet signature. For many who came after, she set a blueprint. Singers like Lisa Fischer, Tata Vega, and Judith Hill, artists who built careers as both soloists and indispensable session voices, followed paths she helped clear. They studied her phrasing, her discipline, her ability to melt into a song without disappearing inside it. When the documentary 20 Feet from Stardom shined light on the overlooked brilliance of background singers, Clydie King's spirit hovered over every frame. She had lived that story decades earlier, long before the world had the language to celebrate it. Her influence wasn't just musical, it was moral. In an era that often rewarded ego, she stood for humility. She taught that contribution can be its own form of glory, that the unseen can still shape the visible. Younger artists who learned her name through vinyl credits or whispers in studio corridors often spoke of her as a symbol of perseverance. She never stopped showing up, one musician recalled. She gave everything, every time, even when no one was watching. The songs she touched tell the story better than words. When the Rolling Stones recorded Exile on Main Street, it was her harmonies that gave its rough edges warmth. When B.B. King took the stage, her backing lines softened his guitar's cry. On Dylan's gospel albums, her voice sounded like conviction itself, weary but unwavering. Each note she sang carried both the pain and peace of someone who had lived her music from the inside out. Today, collectors and historians trace her credits with reverence. They speak of how her work connected the sacred and the secular, linking church pews to concert halls, soul to rock, the South to the world. What Clydie brought to every song was not just sound, it was humanity. She reminded listeners that even behind the loudest performers, there is often a quieter soul holding everything together. Her legacy lives not in monuments or plaques, but in moments: that sudden harmony that lifts a chorus, that voice in the background that feels like memory itself. Decades after she first sang into a microphone, her influence continues to move through generations who never saw her face but somehow recognize her sound. Clydie King's name might not be carved into Hollywood's sidewalks, but it is written, indelibly, in the story of American music. When Clydie King passed away in 2019, the news slipped quietly through the noise of the modern world. No breaking headlines, no industry tributes flashing across television screens. But among musicians, the people who understood what she had given her passing felt like the closing of a sacred chapter. Messages appeared on small corners of the internet, from producers, session players, and singers who had once shared a studio with her. "The world lost one of its purest voices," one wrote. "She never asked for fame, but she gave us music that will never fade." Bob Dylan's words carried the weight of truth. He called her "my ultimate singing partner," a simple statement that meant everything. Dylan had sung beside countless greats, but there was something about Clydie, her restraint, her emotional honesty that left an imprint on him. Their rumored relationship had always been a mystery, but his respect for her was clear. It was as if, in losing her, he was acknowledging all the quiet greatness that the industry had overlooked for generations. In America, her story began to circulate again, not through tabloids, but through memory. Independent radio hosts dedicated late-night segments to her voice. Small record shops in Los Angeles began displaying her vinyl, hand-labeled Clydie King, the voice you forgot you knew. On YouTube, fans rediscovered her live performances, leaving comments that read like confessions. "I grew up hearing her voice and never knew her name until now. This woman carried the sound of my childhood." Outside the United States, the recognition was slower but sincere. British and Japanese collectors, long fascinated by American soul, began revisiting her catalog. In Europe, journalists called her one of the lost architects of modern popular music. Her work with the Rolling Stones alone became the subject of essays exploring how gospel harmonies reshaped rock's emotional depth. Clydie King, the woman once hidden in the mix, was finally being studied, cited, and celebrated. Younger artists, too, found something of themselves in her journey. In a time when fame burns bright and brief, her story offered another model: endurance, craftsmanship, purpose. Singers spoke of her in interviews, calling her a North Star for the background vocalist's soul. Music schools began teaching about her contributions to exile on Main Street and Dylan's gospel period, not as trivia but as testimony. Even the public started to hear her differently. The songs she touched sounded more human when listeners knew who was behind them. When Tumbling Dice or Watching the River Flow played, people began to listen past the headline voice toward the harmony holding it up. In that harmony, they found her. Clydie King's rediscovery wasn't loud or commercial. It was gentle, like her presence had always been. The love came not in waves but in ripples, small gestures of remembrance that spread across time and distance. A critic once wrote, "She sang behind the world and somehow became part of its conscience." That line, simple and true, could have been her epitaph. Today, when people speak her name, it carries both awe and apology. Awe for what she accomplished, apology for how long it took to notice. Hollywood might not have carved her star into the sidewalk, but the music did something better. It made her eternal. For every listener who still hums along, for every musician who still draws strength from her steadiness, Clydie King's legacy lives on not as a forgotten voice, but as the echo that reminds us how powerful humility can sound. The lights have long gone out now, but somewhere in that quiet, her voice still lingers low, warm, steady, like the hum of a memory that refuses to fade. You can almost hear her in the stillness. The way she lifted a song without asking for credit, the way she gave everything and asked for nothing in return. That was Clydie King's gift and her mystery. She spent a lifetime standing just outside the spotlight, and yet her light reached everyone who ever listened. From Dallas to Los Angeles, from Ray Charles to Bob Dylan, her voice became part of America's heartbeat, invisible but unforgettable. Every harmony she sang was a bridge between faith and fame, church and stage, humility and greatness. It's easy to mistake silence for absence, but silence is where Clydie lived. She found meaning in the margins, purpose in the pauses, truth in the background. In a world that worships visibility, she proved that greatness doesn't always need to be seen to be felt. Her story is not a tragedy. It's a lesson, a reminder that the soul of music often belongs to the ones history forgets to name. For those who worked beside her, she was more than a singer. She was the anchor that kept the song from drifting away. For those who discover her now, she stands as proof that quiet strength can echo louder than applause. And for everyone who has ever felt overlooked, her journey whispers a kind of comfort. You don't have to be famous to matter. When we talk about the golden era of music, we remember the stars who stood in front. But maybe we should also remember the ones who stood just behind them, the voices like Clydie King, who turned melodies into memories. Her name might not sit on Hollywood Boulevard, but her sound still travels through every radio, every playlist, every heart that loves a song more for how it feels than for who sings it. Do you think Hollywood ever gave her the recognition she deserved? Do you remember hearing her voice even if you never knew her name? Tell us in the comments. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button and help us keep their light alive. Because some stars never fade, they just shine where fewer eyes can see.